class, I wanted to do a video this time on tissues, but more specifically just kind of a how to study the tissues. This is the chapter that I always call the Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology chapter, because we're chapter 1 is a little more disjointed, but not nearly as in-depth. The concepts are not as difficult to handle. The tissue chapter can be, and certainly initially is, very overwhelming. And that's just because it's a lot of new information, a lot of new terminology. You're thinking about these tissues in ways you've never thought before, and you have this entire chapter to kind of overview every tissue in the body. And so it becomes very, very complicated. And so it's always important for me to give you guidance on what is the best way to structure and organize your studying and your learning of tissues, because I believe if you can get a good plan of study, then the learning becomes very easy, and it's just a natural result of you organizing correctly. Oftentimes, the difficulty in anatomy and physiology is not the information itself, it's being able to appropriately organize the information in your brain and then to quickly and efficiently retrieve it on the quiz or on the test. So to start off with giving you this kind of study framework for tissues, I want you to think about what are different types of baked goods. So let's say you go to the grocery store, and usually the first area of the store that you enter is the baked goods section. Why? Because it smells good, and obviously it gets you hungry. I'm always have a weak spot for fresh baked French bread. So think about what are some different types of baked goods. So of course, maybe you're thinking about cakes and cookies and brownies and pancakes and waffles and bread. We have different types of bread. We have, as I said, French bread. We have sourdough. We have pumpernickel and rye. And of course, there's different types of cookies, and there are different types of cakes. So, and there's muffins and there's scones. There's all these different types of baked goods. And so when we think about all of these different types of baked goods, obviously, as different as a muffin is from a cookie, as from bread, there's something about all of these different examples that is similar enough that they can all be considered a baked good. So if you kind of look at, I made sort of maybe a basic framework here of this. So you can see this table, or almost like a family tree. So we put baked goods at the top, and I just did a couple examples here. So under baked goods, you have these 4 different divisions. You have cakes, cookies, muffins, and then you have bread. And of course, there are subdivisions and examples within each of these. I pulled out the cookie section. And so you can see underneath cookies, you have sugar cookies, chocolate chip cookies, and peanut butter. And then notice we can go down even further. Under chocolate chip, you have double, triple chocolate fudge. You have white chocolate chip. There's all sorts of different types. Just walk down the cookie aisle in the grocery store, and you see all these different types of chocolate chip recipes and kind of batters and things. So when you look at this, we see that we have baked goods at the top: cakes, cookies, muffins, bread, sugar, then under cookies, sugar, chocolate chip, peanut butter, and under chocolate chip, double, triple chocolate fudge, white chocolate chip, and so on. So notice, no matter how many subdivisions we create, everything ultimately comes from, if this is a family tree, everything ultimately comes from a baked good. So if you kind of look right here, we see baked goods, and you can see this little tiny line, and it splits into cakes, cookies, muffins, and bread. Well, this single little line right here under baked goods represents all of the things that cakes, cookies, muffins, bread share in common. So if we start at the bottom, you can see that there's something about double, triple chocolate fudge and white chocolate chip that they share something in common to make them both chocolate chip. And there's something about sugar cookies, chocolate chip cookies, and peanut butter cookies that all share something in common that allows them to be organized and grouped under cookies. And then there's something about cakes, cookies, muffins, and bread, that allows them to all be considered baked goods. So what are those things, just 2 or 3 things that all baked goods have in common? So think about that. So you could say baked goods, they're all baked, right? They have flour, they have maybe some sort of binding agent, they have egg, they have milk, they have oil, they maybe have sugar. So there's a lot of things that all of these have in common. So I'll just kind of simplify this. So if we go back here, what are baked goods? Let's just simplify it. What do they all have in common? You could really simplify and say you have dry components and you have the wet components. But let's just say this. So what are baked goods? What do they all have in common? They all have flour, they all have some type of oil, they all have egg, and they all have some sort of extras added into it. But just like when we go back and see this, even though bread and cookies have flour, oil, egg, and extras, there's clearly something different about bread than cookies. Some people like cookies, some people don't like bread. Some people like specific types of bread, some people don't like other types of bread. Well, why is that? Even though they all have the same basic things in common, it is the proportion and type of these things that makes the end result different. So realize that small differences on the front end make big changes on the back end. So if we go back here, well, we can see, how is a cookie different than a cake? Well, it's the proportion of the amount of egg that you put in. It's the proportion of the flour. It's the way that you mix it that's going to make it different than a cake. It's the shape that you put it in is going to make a cookie different than a cake. And so then when we go within cookies, what makes a sugar cookie different than a chocolate chip cookie? Well, obviously, sugar and chocolate chip cookies are going to have more in common than cookies and cakes. But some people like sugar cookies, some people would prefer chocolate chip. Well, why is that? Even though the flour, the oil, and the egg proportions may be the same, it's those extras, those small changes of those extras that make a difference. Obviously, with chocolate chip, the extra that you're adding in is going to be those chocolate chips. With peanut butter, you're going to be adding peanut butter into there. So it's those small changes, those small differences on the front end that by the time you get to the end result, it's something very different. So obviously a blueberry muffin is very different than angel food cake, even though it all started with the same basic components. So I hope this analogy makes sense, because this is exactly what we're going to see when we get into tissues. There, at the very top of our family tree is the word tissue, and there are 4 different subtypes of tissues immediately. We have epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And I always like to simplify the information to its core component, because that's going to help you memorize it. So with epithelial, I like to remember these as walls and gates. We know what a wall is, we know what gates do, so that gives you a real nice relationship between structure and function. But already we know there are different types of walls, there are different types of gates. We have picket fences, we have brick walls, we have cast iron fences. Each of these has different structures, which then means different functions, but ultimately all walls do the same thing. We have connective tissues. Really the simplest word for connective would be they connect things, but I'm going to use support. Muscle, all muscle tissue is designed for contraction, even though there are 3 very different types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And then nervous tissue, there's different types of nervous tissue, different types of cells, but it's all designed for communication. So tissues at the top, 4 subclasses under tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Well, there's clearly something about these 4 very different tissues. For instance, epithelial tissue, if you think about like your skin, has a lot of epithelial tissue, but then connective is blood. So blood is a tissue, just like your skin, components of your skin is a tissue. These things seem very different, but they're all considered tissue. So what are those core common components that all tissues share? All tissues contain specialized cells. If you are a tissue, by definition, you are a group of cells working together. And then different specialized cells have specific cell junctions for different functions or specific functions. So all tissues have specialized cells, and they have extracellular matrix, abbreviated ECM. And the ECM has 2 components: ground substance and protein fiber. So you can think of all tissues share 3 things: specialized cells, ground substance, and protein fibers. As I said, ground substance and protein fibers makes up the ECM. So you have the cellular components and you have the extracellular components. And realize it is the different tissues, blood, bone, compact bone, spongy bone, simple squamous epithelium, stratified cuboidal epithelium, the nervous tissue in your brain. All of these have specialized cells, ground substance, protein fibers, but is the different types of cells, the different types of ground substance, and the proportion of these three things that creates the different end result, just like we saw with our different baked goods. You start with the same ingredients, but it's the way that you tweak the ingredients. It's the amount that you do. It's using coconut flour instead of whole wheat flour that gives you a different result. So let me show you, just like we had our family tree, our concept map of our baked goods. Here is one with tissues, and you can see that I pulled out some specifics from connective tissue. And this basically is just created from what you already have in your book. So you see tissues at the top, divided into epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous or neural. But you can see even under connective, you have connective tissue proper, which just means generalized connective tissue, and you have specialized. Within connective tissue proper, you divide it into loose and dense, and even within loose, you have specific types, areolar or adipose reticular. Just like instead of loose, if we said cookies and you had chocolate chip, peanut butter, and sugar, we also have dense connective tissue divided into regular and irregular, and you can see under specialized. And realize that even when you see, for instance, cartilage, there are still 3 specific types of cartilage under there. So you already can see how overwhelming this chapter gets, but this is why it's so important to have a framework up front. When you encounter this information, you already have sort of your filing cabinet to organize this information. And realize that what I want you to do is not learn every detail, not memorize every detail in your chapter. I want you to put this in your framework so that as soon as you read or encounter something, you just need like 2 or 3 unique features of adipose tissue to differentiate it from reticular or from irregular connective tissue. So you don't have to memorize everything. It's just what are those 2 or 3 unique things that separate epithelial from connective, that separate loose from dense, that separate areolar from adipose. So kind of with that, I want to get into another type of analogy that I think is important. Now that you have created your basic framework in your brain, how is the way that you can apply this information? And I want you to think about if you were a tissue detective. So this is the other framework, because I want you to realize on the test, any questions related to the tissues basically start off the same way. What is this tissue? That is your job. Identify this tissue. I will show you a picture or give you a description of a tissue, and your job is to identify it. So in the same way, if you were, say, a homicide detective, you are given a dead body, and you're supposed to figure out, how did the body die? How did that person die? How long has that person been dead? So this is the way that we're going to apply that information. So let's think about this. If you are solving a murder, whether you're a detective in New Orleans, San Francisco, Chicago, whatever, you're going to go through the same basic progressions to try to solve the crime. So what are those going to be, those first questions? All you know is that when you walk through the door, there's going to be a dead body. You have to figure out, what is the likely cause of death? What is the likely time of death? Where is the body located? All of these questions are the big picture general questions that are going to help you narrow down all of the possible options. Because think about all the ways somebody could die. Well, you can't go and investigate and prove and disprove or disprove every option. You've got to invest your time in what is the most efficient use of your time. So you're looking first at the most obvious things. Where is the body located? Okay, the body is in the kitchen. Okay, if the body's in the kitchen, it is likely that they didn't drown in the bathtub. If the body is outside, that's going to give you certain initial clues. What is the likely cause of death? Well, first of all, you could think of a suicide versus a homicide versus death by natural causes. And there's going to be some overlap, but there's also some things that are going to make one decision more likely than another. But also, if you get more specific, let's say it is a homicide. Well, obviously a gunshot is going to look different than a stabbing. So if you can look at your obvious clues, you may be wrong, but you got to start somewhere. So if you look at the obvious clues, that at least gives you a place to start to investigate further. So it's all about, if you were a homicide detective, it's thinking about how to narrow down all of your options. Because remember, before you open that door and before you see the body, everything is a possibility. So you need to start with the easiest and most obvious clues to help eliminate the things that you know it's not. So for example, I already said, what are the basic obvious things that differentiates a gunshot from a stabbing, a poisoning from a beating with candlestick? Think of course, the board game Clue. What are the obvious differences between there? Obvious, but then, of course, if it is a gunshot, there are different types of guns that could have caused that. But you're not going to investigate and try to decide, was it a 22 or a 38? If you haven't first determined that you even think it is a gunshot. You're not going to start looking for a bullet casing if you see somebody in a filled up bathtub with a toaster sitting in it. You can also think, how can you tell if a person has been dead for a long time? How can you tell the difference between somebody who is recently dead or has been dead for a while? Obviously, there are going to be different clues that make that really obvious. And if the person has been recently dead, you're going to respond differently than if the person has been dead for a while. Well, remember, this is the framework that you're using when you are going to investigate what tissue are you looking at. So let's just apply the same analogy to now being a tissue detective. So you are solving a tissue mystery. What type of tissue is this? You are presented a picture or a description. So the questions, these big picture questions. What are the proportion and type of cells that you are seeing? What is the proportion or type of the ECM or the ground substance or the protein fibers? What is the location of this tissue? Or maybe you look at what is the basic function of the tissue. If, as we saw a couple slides ago, if the function is a wall, is a barrier between the inside of your body and the outside of your body, or we're going to already assume it's epithelial and investigate from there. If it's transport, well, maybe we're going to be thinking something like connective tissue. We're already starting to think maybe it's blood, but at least gives us a place to start. So remember, it's all about trying to narrow down your options. Remember, start with the easiest and most obvious clues to help eliminate options. So what are some of these questions you can ask? So what differentiates epithelial tissue from connective tissue? What are just 2 or 3 obvious things that do this? Location, epithelial tissue line surfaces. Epithelial tissue contains a high percentage of cells, and if you can contain a high percentage of cells, then that means automatically you have a low percentage of extracellular matrix. Connective tissue, low density of cells, high proportion of extracellular matrix. How is a squamous epithelial cell different from a columnar epithelial cell? Well, they structurally look different, which means they have functional differences. How is dense connective tissue different from loose connective tissue? What makes dense dense and what makes loose loose? Well, this has to do with the relative percentage of protein fibers. So with any of these different tissues, just write out the type of tissue and just do bullet point 2 or 3 specific things that are, oh man, if I see these 2 or 3 things, then I'm pretty sure it's this. Just like if you were a homicide detective, if I see these 2 or 3 things, then I'm going to think it was a murder by gunshot. Or if I see these 2 or 3 things, it was clearly a poisoning. You don't have to know everything about everything. You just need 2 or 3 main things to help you narrow that down. So once again, putting this chart back up just to remind you, so Each of these single vertical lines represents those 2 or 3 unique features that's going to allow you to see what is it that all, of course, what is it that all tissues have in common? And then as you come this way, what are the 2 or 3 things that make epithelial unique, the 2 or 3 things for connective, and so on. And you just keep following the chart all the way down, and each time you have a few more unique things that help determine, are you going left or right down the family tree. So I hope that this has helped. Spend some time with it. I can tell you tissues, it is manageable. You can figure it out. You just have to spend some time with it. But as always, just reach out if you have any questions.